Hey everyone, it's Dr. Romney. Today I'm going to talk about sort of an interesting hack I learned in graduate school that really taught me a lot about how to pay attention to how somebody makes me feel in the room, how the client makes me feel in the room. But this actually has a lot of bearing for how we feel when we're around narcissistic people. It's something I also attempted to teach to the 3 undergraduates who actually stayed awake in my classes, but I think they got it. So one thing you got to remember, you are not the only way who feels this way about the narcissistic person. This applies to our understanding about any person we knew. Now, again, as I said, when I taught students, including graduate students who are going to go on to be therapists, I always told them, pay attention to how you feel when you're doing therapy with the client, when you're in the room with the client, because it's a really important piece of information. And it may very likely offer you some data and sign and information of how other people feel with this person. It's so important for us as therapists that we are aware of how a client leaves us feeling because of something called countertransference. We don't want to do anything to botch up the therapy. But if you pay attention to that feeling, and a very wise supervisor taught this to me, it gives us a big piece of information. And it tells us, and I can promise you this, other people feel this way with this person too. Now, speaking of therapy training, if you are a therapist, or life coach, or therapist in training, I am launching a program in January of next year, 2024, that will be focused on how to support clients healing from narcissistic abuse. See the link in the video description. We'll be talking about issues just like this, but I think this applies to everyone. When it comes to narcissistic folks, this whole how do you feel when you're with them, it gets tricky, and knowing that other people feel this way too. Remember, narcissistic people wear masks, and that means that people that the narcissistic person may view as having more status or importance or value, or maybe they just met you at a social event, y'all are going to be treated better by the narcissistic person. So unless the high status people around the narcissist are really intuitive, they're going to miss out on the signs. And this is why people may have such divergent experiences of the narcissistic person. But I have to say, most people are not viewed as high status by the narcissistic person. And there are a lot of you who are, frankly, having the same experience of the narcissistic person. Sometimes the feeling you get when you're with someone narcissistic or antagonistic, it's something you just can't name. You just feel it when you're with them. As I close my eyes and think about some of the more narcissistic people I've known, in their presence from the beginning, I felt on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop, like if I didn't win them over, they would walk, or as though they were looking right through me. But the bottom line is in their presence, from the beginning, I felt uncomfortable. And what that means is that experience you're having, I promise you, someone else is having this experience with them as well. Listening, going back to the therapy stuff I was talking about, when multiple therapists happen to be working with a single client, and all of us have signed releases to speak with each other or working in a group practice setup or something, it's very clear that the therapists are having similar experiences of the narcissistic person. It's not that the therapists are being judgmental, it's an acknowledgement of the discomfort everyone is having. We often don't pay attention to these feelings because we often do not have the experience of having them validated. We're not going to be with someone and walk up to other people and say, how did you feel with that person? Or how do you feel with that person? We may often think it's just us, and that maybe we're just being weird or judgy. In fact, I want you to stop and think to yourself how relieved you have felt in the past when you finally might hear someone saying, oh yeah, no, I never felt uncomfortable. I never felt comfortable with that person. It can be very reassuring to hear that. But we often don't ask, and we don't want to look bad. We don't want to, but let's talk about that. Why don't we ask, right? Why don't we ask? We ask because we don't want to be the gossips. We don't want to be the people who talk smack about people. We don't want to be the petty person who says uncomfortable things or puts a person in an uncomfortable position by asking them their opinion. We want to give people the chance. And if you're going through narcissistic abuse or you've been through it, odds are that you no longer feel like you can trust yourself anyhow. But we don't have to ask someone doesn't that person kind of make you feel weird, or aren't they awful? I don't trust them. Rather, you can ask a more open-ended, how did you feel when you were with that person? Listen, we all sometimes actually do that at work, especially if you work in recruitment or anything like that, but we do it at work. And even there, again, there's this unwillingness for us to sit with our intuition and really feel how something doesn't feel good. People with antagonistic personalities in general leave other people sort of feeling on edge. Maybe it's a projection of the on-edgeness that narcissistic people hold within themselves. Maybe because there's sort of a cobra ready to strike energy that many narcissistic people have. But since the very first day I ever saw my first client, my gut told me when I was working with someone antagonistic, I just never quite felt right. I wish I had more people who told me, yeah, let's work with that. So if we can take that into our lives and really pay attention to it, it doesn't mean that we start saying 5 seconds into knowing someone, nope, no way, that's a narcissistic person. But rather we give ourselves permission to slow down, to not be as vulnerable, to not open up as fast, to take our time and not put ourselves in a risky position and slowly let it unfold. The few times that I have not done this in my life, I kind of rushed getting to know someone, it ended me up in dangerous and even traumatic circumstances. You learn. And with time, you learn to pay attention to that feeling. I'm older now, much older. And I do ask the question in as casual a way as I can of other people, how did you feel with that person? 9 times out of 10, when I ask someone whom I know or trust, they will report back when I'm talking about someone who made me uncomfortable. And sometimes it's even ephemeral or nonspecific, and it may be like, yeah, I don't know, it wasn't comfortable. And sometimes neither of us could name it. Or would give more details like that. I found them too pushy, too aloof, too demanding, too something. It's funny. We're always passing around things amongst our social groups. We're passing around movie recommendations and TV shows to stream and restaurant ideas and other ideas. But when it comes to the feeling that people evoke in us, we often don't think to share. It is a far more useful strategy than you think. If people are being honest, and especially when we are dealing with antagonistic folks, it can be a validator of an experience you can't quite put a name on. It can be so relieving to hear that your experience was paralleled and shared by someone else. Always trust that sense of how someone makes you feel. There is often a world of information in that sensation. And always remember, too, the way you feel. You're not the only person who feels this way about them. Now, of course, others may have different experiences of them. It's not about making someone say, no, you had to have had my experience. But that may be a function of them maybe having had a different kind of relationship with them. But that said, whatever experience you are having, trust that. If it gets validated, I promise you someone else is having that experience. Someone else is having it. And learning about that can turn the gaslights off immediately. And more importantly, it can make you more likely to trust your gut and intuition in the future. As I was thinking about this video, there were a couple of different personal circumstances that came up. One involved people I work with who would say to me, we don't like how this feels. We don't like how this feels. But they wouldn't give me specifics. They're like, yeah, I don't know, shady. If I had listened to them, we actually would have avoided a lot of mess. But I didn't. I think of other situations in my life, the way a relationship was moving in the beginning. Something about it didn't sit right, but for other reasons. And it's interesting because sometimes we don't always get another opinion. That issue at work, had met the person. They were giving me their feedback and I wasn't paying attention. So sometimes we don't actually pay attention to our intuition. That's a separate issue. But there are other times when we don't think to ask others, or we don't get to have the data. Someone else doesn't get to meet someone. It's why it's never always a bad idea to have someone meet someone new you might be dating early on, and always have that friend who will be willing to be willing to call it out clearly. But it does mean that we've got to kind of move some of the trauma bonded weeds out of the way to be able to trust that feeling. But I have to tell you, just today, the very day I am shooting this video, I've had this experience where I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. And I texted someone, I'm like, how did you feel? And they literally mirrored what I said to a T. I felt like someone lifted 10 pounds off my shoulders. The situation is still a mess. But you've had that experience of someone saying, oh yeah, no, that is how I felt. For you to think about that in your lives, how many times you're like, does this feel funky? I'm thinking even about another recent work event where I'm like, this doesn't feel right. Someone new came into the position and I turned to this person in private. I said, how did that all feel? And she's like, that was a hot mess. 20 pounds, 50 pounds off your shoulders. We don't always get this. We're so concerned with playing nice or not sharing it, or maybe we're wrong. I promise you, when you're dealing, especially when you're dealing with someone antagonistic or narcissistic, someone else is having the same experience as you. It can sometimes scare you off if you do say to someone, did anyone else feel funky about that? And everyone's like, no, I thought they were great. I will say that when I'm with groups of people who don't get narcissism and they're sort of feel-good people and let's give everyone a chance people, they're the ones who'll say, I thought that was fine. I have to tell you, there's a certain special pleasure for when it all goes south because you experienced it as awful and that person's awful and you kind of get to a little bit of a twist the knife, I told you so. But I promise you, other people who are at all linked into their gut and their intuition, someone else out there is having that experience. The key is, and maybe it's luck, is that you sort of cross-check your experience with someone else's. If you're fortunate, or if you ask enough people, you'll hear it. But even if you don't, trust yourself, because I promise you, that person having this experience as well is out there. Thanks again.